May 1943. The Pacific jungle fell silent. A single sound broke through the heat and buzzing insects, the clatter of a rifle hitting the ground. A young Japanese soldier, barefoot, uniform torn, staggered from the green shadows and raised his empty hands toward a line of American Marines. He expected what every poster, every commander, every whispered order had told him to expect: death. But instead of a rifle shot, a corporal stepped forward and handed him a canteen, water. Clean, cold water. He hesitated, then drank, and in that moment, something cracked. The myths, the fear, the indoctrination, all of it started to fall away. That single act of mercy, a drink in a jungle of death, would echo across oceans, because he wasn't alone. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, from Guadalcanal to New Guinea, would soon discover a truth their government never wanted them to see. They were told that capture meant dishonor, that Americans were monsters, but what they found was humanity. And on the other side of that discovery lay one of the quietest, strangest stories of the entire war, the story of Japanese prisoners in American hands. Men who came expecting death and instead found kindness. Men who would carry that secret home, unable to speak it aloud, because in war, mercy can be as disorienting as cruelty. Section 1. Taught to fear the enemy. From the first day of training, Imperial Japan drilled a single truth into its soldiers: surrender is worse than death. Every soldier memorized the Imperial rescript: do not suffer the disgrace of being captured alive. It wasn't just an order, it was a creed, a religion of death over defeat. Before deployment, propaganda films showed American soldiers as grotesque, fanged demons, white devils who tortured captives and desecrated bodies. School children were told that if America ever invaded Japan, every citizen, man, woman, child, should take one enemy with them before dying. The result was a nation programmed for extinction. Surrender wasn't cowardice, it was contamination. Captured Japanese soldiers knew what awaited them if they were caught: beatings, mutilation, humiliation, execution. That's what their commanders said. That's what Tokyo radio screamed. And so when those first prisoners were taken alive on Guadalcanal, in the Solomons, in the Philippines, they didn't just fear death, they feared being seen. Most tried to off themselves rather than face capture. Some held grenades to their chests, others leapt off cliffs or begged comrades to pull the trigger, but a few didn't. They collapsed from exhaustion, from malaria, from wounds too deep to move, and woke up, still alive, in the hands of the enemy. What they saw next shattered everything they believed about America. The first ship that carried wounded Japanese soldiers to an American hospital looked, from a distance, like salvation disguised as confusion. Stretchers lined the deck. Men who days earlier had clawed through mud and smoke now lay beneath white sheets. Some blinked in disbelief, waiting for punishment. But punishment never came. The medics treated them the same way they treated the Marines from Tarawa or Guadalcanal. Bandages replaced old rags. Morphine eased pain. Hands that once held rifles now held spoons and water cups. The air smelled of antiseptic, not blood. Under the Geneva Convention, each prisoner received nearly 3,000 calories a day, more than most had eaten in weeks, sometimes months. Steamed vegetables, rice, even bits of meat. Many tried to refuse, convinced it was a trick. One doctor wrote, "They waited for us to strike. When we didn't, they began to eat." Aboard these ships, translators overheard the same whispered question in Japanese again and again: why are they doing this? No one had an answer. For many prisoners, the realization came slowly that they had entered a world that operated by rules. Their own side had abandoned, that the enemy they'd been told was barbaric was in fact merciful. When the ships reached California, the shock deepened. At Angel Island, prisoners were escorted through delousing stations, medical exams, and vaccination lines. They expected humiliation. Instead, they were greeted with politeness. Guards offered soap, clean towels, uniforms, no beatings, no torture. One prisoner later wrote in a diary he never dared send home, "They treat us as if we are still human." This makes no sense. And for those about to be transferred inland, the greatest revelation still lay ahead, waiting across the endless heartland of America. March 1942. A small train rolled into the heart of Wisconsin, carrying the first Japanese prisoner to ever set foot in the American Midwest. His name was Kazuo Sakamaki, commander of a midget submarine, captured during the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States labeled him Prisoner of War No. 1. For 5 long months, he lived alone at Camp McCoy, one man behind a fence of silence. Then, one by one, others arrived. Dozens became hundreds, hundreds became thousands. By 1944, there were nearly 2,700 Japanese prisoners at the camp. Their journey to Wisconsin had already felt like a journey to another planet. From Angel Island, they were loaded onto trains that rumbled across the American interior, mile after mile of farmland, red barns, endless factories. Cities, bigger than Tokyo, blurred past the windows. Lights that never went out. They stared in silence, realizing something their officers had never admitted. America didn't just fight the war, it manufactured it. By the time they reached Camp McCoy, they expected barbed wire and brutality. Instead, they found something unthinkable. Medical inspections, showers, fresh uniforms, vaccinations against disease, beds with clean sheets. Each man was assigned a barrack number, a bunk, and even a towel embroidered, and with U.S. Army. The guards spoke politely, giving orders with words instead of kicks. No shouting, no beatings, no hatred. For men who had been told capture meant shame, this civility felt more frightening than cruelty. They waited for the catch, for the moment when the kindness would turn into humiliation, but it never did. What came instead was abundance. The mess hall at Camp McCoy delivered 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Hot food, served on metal trays, with portions larger than most had seen since childhood. Bacon, eggs, soup thick with vegetables, white bread still warm from the oven. For soldiers who'd survived on handfuls of rice and bitter roots, it felt like sorcery. Some refused to eat, believing the food poisoned. So the guards demonstrated taking bites from the same trays, smiling, gesturing, "Eat." Slowly. Suspicious hands reached out and tasted, and then the shock hit. One prisoner later wrote, "The taste was proof that everything we had been told was a lie. Food became revelation. Abundance became truth." Every bite was an education about power, about production, about a country that could feed its enemies better than Japan fed its heroes. The soldiers didn't just taste defeat, they saw it. On every plate. Fresh vegetables, canned fruit, milk from Wisconsin farms so vast they could have swallowed Japanese prefectures whole. The camp records showed it clearly. Many prisoners developed stomach pain because their shrunken bodies couldn't process so much food so quickly. Even that was treated with gentle medicine, careful advice, and patience. The same doctors who patched up wounded Americans now treated men who'd once fired on them. And in the sterile light of the infirmary, those men began to realize they were witnessing something Japan's empire could never build. A nation rich enough, confident enough, to be kind. Beyond the mess halls, a new kind of curiosity began to stir, one that would soon erupt into something as ordinary and as astonishing as a baseball game. By the summer of 1944, Camp McCoy no longer looked like the place these men had feared. The fences were still there, the guard towers still watched, but inside, life had changed. The fear had drained away, replaced by something almost impossible: normalcy. Every day followed a rhythm. Roll call, work assignments, meals that always arrived on time, and in between small miracles. The camp canteen opened its shelves to prisoners, stocked with items no Japanese soldier had ever imagined finding in captivity: candy bars, chocolate, chewing gum, tobacco, even bottles of Coca-Cola, priced the same as in any American town, 5 cents. At first, they didn't know what to make of it. The glass bottles hissed when opened, the dark liquid bubbled and fizzed. Suspicious eyes watched the guards drink it first. Then, slowly, they tried it. The first sip burned their throats. The second made them cough. The third made them smile. It was sweet, cold, alive, unlike anything they'd ever tasted. One prisoner later wrote, "This drink tastes like it comes from another world, a world without war, without hunger." The Coca-Cola became a symbol, a 5-cent revelation. Proof that America's power wasn't just in bombs or factories, but in ordinary abundance, a sweetness so common it no longer needed to be earned. For men who'd grown up on scarcity, that was more shocking than any weapon. The prisoners began to earn wages 80 cents a day for labor, officers receiving monthly pay in camp scrip. They could buy soap, postcards, small luxuries. They could walk to the canteen, buy a soda, and feel for a moment human again. The American guards noticed the change too. Prisoners who once stared at the ground now joked, smiled, even waved. And then, one afternoon, someone rolled a baseball across the yard. A guard tossed it back. Within days, they were playing games together, guards versus prisoners, laughter echoing across the barbed wire. A home run by a Japanese player brought cheers from both sides. In those games, the language barrier vanished. For 9 innings, there was no enemy, only men remembering life before the war. As trust grew, so did culture. The prisoners asked permission to plant gardens. They built small Buddhist shrines from scrap wood, using incense provided by the YMCA. They crafted paper flowers from colored crepe, performed plays with hand-sewn costumes, and recreated scenes of Tokyo street life under the fluorescent glow of the barracks. They were given permission to visit the local cinema under light guard, Hollywood musicals, westerns, stories filled with wealth and freedom that mirrored what they saw in camp. They watched Americans on screen drink Coca-Cola the same way they did now. They saw electric lights, cars, homes with running water. And they realized something profound. This wasn't propaganda, this was reality. A country that could afford kindness, could afford victory. The prisoners began to understand America didn't have to crush Japan through hate. It could defeat it simply by showing what peace looked like. And still, the most humbling revelation was yet to come in the factories and farms of Wisconsin, where prisoners would finally see the machinery of abundance up close. When the first work details were announced, the Japanese prisoners braced for humiliation. They imagined back-breaking labor, digging ditches, hauling stone, the kind of punishment they expected from a victorious enemy. But when the trucks rolled out of Camp McCoy, what they found waiting beyond the gates wasn't cruelty. It was something far more devastating to their pride: efficiency. The prisoners were assigned to farms, canning plants, and dairy operations across Wisconsin, the very heart of America's agricultural machine. They watched fields stretch beyond the horizon, flat and endless, shimmering with corn and wheat. On one farm alone, a single family produced more milk than entire Japanese prefectures. Machines replaced hands, conveyor belts replaced effort. They saw America's true weapon, not soldiers or bombers, but capacity. At one canning factory, they stood in awe as machines processed tons of vegetables per hour. Steel arms sorted and packed produce with mechanical precision. Even the waste bruised tomatoes, imperfect beans, was tossed aside, trucked off to feed livestock. America literally threw away food that could have fed Japanese villages for weeks. One prisoner whispered, "They waste what we worship." Another murmured, "How can we fight this?" The guards, meanwhile, relaxed. At many work sites, rifles were leaned casually against trucks or walls. Sometimes the guards dozed in the sun, trusting the prisoners not to run. And they didn't. Where would they go? Back to a country drowning in defeat and starvation? Each day, the same unspoken realization deepened. Japan wasn't just losing the war, it had never been capable of winning it. Its empire was built on faith and sacrifice. America's was built on steel, soil, and industry. Some of the younger prisoners began to watch the machines with fascination. A few asked questions, studying how the mechanisms worked. Others simply stood in silence, absorbing the scale of it all. They weren't just laborers now, they were witnesses. Witnesses to a nation whose strength came not from desperation, but from plenty. And then came the smaller moments, the moments that pierced their discipline. A farmer's wife offering coffee to a prisoner, a child waving as trucks passed down the road, kindness from strangers who owed them nothing. For men raised to die before dishonor, such simple gestures carried unbearable weight. By the end of 1944, the guards noticed something had changed. The prisoners no longer watched them with suspicion. They helped load the trucks faster, cleaned the tools without being asked. When officers approached, guards would sometimes be found asleep under a tree, rifles resting nearby, and it was the prisoners who quietly woke them so no one would get in trouble. Somewhere along the line, the enemy became familiar, and the fear on both sides of the fence disappeared. That realization, as profound as it was, came at a price, because with it came the heaviest truth of all. Loyalty to Japan meant silence, and silence meant burying what they now knew, that the world they had been told to die for no longer existed. As the months turned into years, the fences around Camp McCoy began to feel less like a cage and more like a border between two realities, the one the prisoners had been taught to believe in and the one they were now living. Inside the barracks, silence reigned at night, not from fear, but from thought. Each man carried a quiet war of his own, between pride and gratitude, between the emperor's command and what his own eyes had seen. Letters were permitted. The Red Cross provided paper, envelopes, and the promise of delivery, but few ever wrote. For a Japanese soldier, surrender was not survival, it was erasure. To admit being alive in enemy hands was to shame your family, dishonor your ancestors, and desecrate the code you were raised under. Better to let home believe you had died bravely than confess that you lived comfortably among your captors. Yet a few wrote anyway, not to send, but to remember. Private diaries, folded papers hidden in boots, scraps of words written by men trying to make sense of a war that no longer made sense. One diary read, "If I told my mother that the enemy feeds us meat and fruit, she would think I have lost my mind. She would say I dishonor my father's death with lies." Those lines, found decades later, captured what could never be spoken in 1945, that mercy itself had become unbearable. While the Japanese prisoners lived in safety, across the Pacific, a different fate unfolded for Allied captives. On the Burma-Siam Railway, death came in waves of starvation and disease. On the infamous Hell ships, men suffocated in unmarked cargo holds, 22,000 never reaching shore. At camps in the Philippines, Americans lost an average of 60 pounds from deliberate starvation. At Bataan, at Changi, at Sandakan, cruelty was policy. The mortality rate for Western prisoners in Japanese hands reached up to 40%, 10 times higher than in German captivity. Japan had signed the Geneva Convention but never ratified it. In practice, it meant nothing. The empire's officers had pledged to uphold civilized standards, then ordered beatings, forced labor, and executions in their place. The Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy didn't know the full scope of it, but they could feel it in the contrast between how they were treated and what they had once believed. They had been told Americans were monsters, but the monsters never came. Instead, they were given food, books, games, medical care. They were treated as men. And that treatment, more than any bomb or bullet, fractured the foundation of everything they had been raised to die for. Some began to wonder, if the Americans treat enemies this well, what do they give to friends? If their prisoners eat like this, how do their soldiers live? And if mercy could exist here in war, then what else had they been wrong about? These were questions too dangerous to ask aloud. So the letters stayed unsent, the diaries hidden, the truth buried beneath the shame of survival. Because to speak the truth about America's kindness was, in its own way, another act of betrayal. By the spring of 1945, news began to ripple through Camp McCoy like distant thunder. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. And every prisoner understood what that meant. America's full strength, every ship, every bomb, every ounce of industrial fire would now turn toward Japan. They didn't need to hear it from the guards. They could see it in the newspapers. They could feel it in the tone of the radio broadcasts, in the sudden silence during roll call when officers read out the latest reports. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each name was another wound, each island another funeral. In the barracks, the prisoners began to whisper what none dared say aloud. Japan was finished. The men who had seen America's factories, its fields, its waste, they had already known. But now, it was official. The empire was collapsing under its own delusion of invincibility. Then, in August, came the unthinkable. 2 flashes of light, 2 cities gone, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The war was over. The announcement reached Camp McCoy within hours. For a long moment, no one moved. No cheers, no shouting, only silence deep and heavy as the forests around them. Some wept, some bowed their heads. Some simply stared into space, unable to process what it meant. They had survived a war their families did not. They had eaten while their country starved. They had lived not by loyalty, but by kindness. The guards didn't celebrate. Many understood the mixed weight of that moment. They brought newspapers, let the prisoners read the headlines. Japan surrenders. The words looked almost merciful, printed in black ink instead of written in blood. In the months that followed, repatriation began. One by one, the prisoners boarded ships bound for a homeland they no longer recognized. They carried new uniforms, small souvenirs, sometimes even a bottle of Coca-Cola, tucked away proof that this strange chapter had really happened. But what they carried most was invisible, a quiet understanding that the enemy had shown them something their own leaders had not: humanity. When their ships reached Japan, they stepped into a world of rubble. Cities flattened, factories gone, children starving in the streets, and they said nothing. They could not tell their families about the American guards who laughed with them, the food that healed them, the doctors who treated them as equals. They could not speak of baseball games, of pay wages, of plays and shrines and kindness. To do so would sound like betrayal or worse, insanity, so they buried it. Deep. Some tried to rebuild their lives quietly. Others lived with the guilt of surviving when braver men had chosen death. A few, decades later, would finally speak in old age, in interviews, their voices trembling with memory. One former prisoner said simply, "I expected death and received medical care. I expected torture and received vaccinations. I expected starvation and received food. Everything I believed about America was wrong. Everything I believed about my own country was a lie." For him and for thousands like him, the war had not ended with a surrender. It ended the first time an American handed him water in the jungle. It ended with a canteen, a smile, and a truth so powerful it could outlast an empire. Because in the end, it wasn't bombs or bullets that broke Japan's spirit. It was something far quieter, the realization that mercy, even in war, was the ultimate form of strength. When the war finally ended, the men of Camp McCoy returned to a homeland unprepared to hear their truth. They stepped off ships into cities of ash, where the wind still carried the dust of a fallen empire. Families embraced them in tears, but not all of them were welcomed. In a culture built on the ideal of dying with honor, living in enemy hands was shame beyond words. So, the prisoners who had once seen America's kindness simply stayed silent. They hid their memories, their gratitude, their confusion. They lived in a Japan that wanted heroes, not survivors. And yet, buried beneath that silence, their story remained a story that said more about power than any victory parade ever could. Because what those men witnessed wasn't weakness, it wasn't sentimentality. It was strategic mercy, a weapon of civilization sharper than any blade. In camps like McCoy, America demonstrated something astonishing. That strength was not just in how many bombs a nation could drop, but in how it treated those who could no longer fight back. That abundance could defeat desperation. That discipline could defeat fanaticism. That mercy itself could destroy the myth of the enemy. In the quiet routines of those camps, the medical care, the Coca-Cola bottles, the baseball games under the Wisconsin sun, the real psychological war was being won. Not through propaganda, but through example. By showing what life could look like without cruelty. The Geneva Convention wasn't just law, it was identity. It declared to the world, and to the prisoners who saw it firsthand, that democracy and decency could survive even amid total war. That a nation secure in its strength had no need for vengeance. Decades later, when a few old men finally spoke about Camp McCoy, their memories sounded almost unreal. They didn't talk about battles or loss, but about laughter, about gardens, about baseball and clean beds, and about one simple truth that no ideology could erase. They could afford to be kind, one man said softly, because they were already free. In that sentence lies the real legacy of America's prisoner camps, not just victory, but vindication. A victory of values as much as weapons. A triumph not shouted, but lived. While empires rose and fell, while generals plotted and cities burned, somewhere in the middle of Wisconsin, a Japanese soldier learned to smile again. And in that moment, in that fragile human act, the war, in its cruelest form, was quietly defeated, because in the end, mercy is the ultimate weapon.